I think the first thing to do is actually to situate the South China Sea. And the whole of Southeast Asia, archipelagic, peninsula Southeast Asia, the geography is extremely complex and difficult in political and legal terms. It's just the nature of the physical environment. When you interpose those legal and political contexts upon that physical geography, you get a very difficult and problematic region in terms of boundaries, political disputes, territorial disputes, and so on. Another thing to say about the South China Sea is that whilst it's one of the several semi-enclosed seas in the littoral of East Asia, it's still a pretty big body of water. I think people tend to look at a map of the world and sort of compare it to the oceans and think, oh, it's a pretty small area, but I think you need to keep in mind it's still talking about a fairly large area. I think it's around about the 6th or 7th largest body of water on the planet, so it is quite an extensive area. And whilst I won't get into the Bill of the Sea Convention in any detail, if you just remember that when the types of jurisdiction that coastal states can claim under the convention, this quite constrained geography means that you have inherent problems in Southeast Asia, I think more complicated than any other part of the world. One of the interesting questions that too often actually doesn't come up is, what is the South China Sea? What are the limits of this body of water? And it's actually a bit of a moot point. The international organisation that has responsibility for these issues, the International Hydrographic Organisation, has a publication called The Limits of the Oceans and the Seas. The current edition dates back to about 1953, and this is the map for the South China Sea based on the 2002 draft new edition of this publication. And for 10 years, the IHO have been squabbling about getting this publication accepted amongst all the international members, and they haven't been able to do so. And the fundamental problem is not actually the South China Sea. There are a number of problems holding it up. Primarily the Koreans, who want to rename the Sea of Japan the East Sea, and the Japanese are not willing to do that, and so that's actually holding up the entire publication. But there are some quite significant changes in the 2002 draft if it ever gets accepted, and these are that the current version includes the Tonkin Gulf within the South China Sea, which is now excluded in this draft. It included the Taiwan Strait, and also the Natuna Sea area right down to the Karamata Strait and the entrance to the Strait of Singapore. So this new map, if the publication ever does get up, will mean that the South China Sea limits are a little bit smaller than they once were believed to be within this international organisation. The South China Sea, as we all know, is very important for international trade. Very high proportion of international trade moves through the South China Sea. I won't give you statistics because you get generally unreliable numbers from a whole bunch of different sources, but it's quite significant. And when you think about the importance now, almost the centrality of Northeast Asian states to the global economy, and the amount of trade that's occurring, pretty much all the resource trade that all the commodities that these countries, not just China, but Japan, Korea, Taiwan, are importing. A pretty large proportion of that is transported via the South China Sea. I've provided this sort of global view of slots, just to give you some idea of the density and the level of shipping intensity. From Australia's perspective, I think it's fair to say that not a lot of our trade it transits directly through the South China Sea, but one area that is quite important for us is this route for our LNG that passes through Lombok and Makassar Strait systems through the Celebes Sea and up here through the Sibutu Passage, and that transits then through the Sulu Sea and the Mindoro Strait up into the northern reaches of the South China Sea. But most of Australia's trade actually doesn't pass through the South China Sea directly. This is a map moving on to the territorial disputes that's been put together by a couple of my colleagues, and it's reasonably accurate. It's been drawn up using coordinates, and it shows where the basic claims are. Different claimants are claiming different parts of these small island and reef territories. The Chinese claim is the same as the Taiwanese claim. They're the same claim. But one of the interesting things about Taiwan is that it's very difficult to gauge exactly the similarities and differences between I think that the Chinese and Taiwanese positions these days. Whilst Taiwan is nominally still the Republic of China, in practice it's moved a long way from where they were in 1947. And one of the interesting things to me is that the Taiwanese have been playing a kind of a funny game in a way, that they've been very cooperative with other states to try and demilitarize the conflict. They occupy the largest island in the Spratly group, Taiping or Utuaba Island, and have been at the forefront, I think, of issues such as marine environmental protection and protecting those important ecosystems. On the other hand, they've been trying to leverage the South China Sea issue as a way of building up diplomatic ties with China. So they've been sort of going hand in hand with China to some extent in recent years for other purposes, which may put them in a difficult position when you, I think, consider that the way that they interpret these claims now, I think, are certainly diverging. One of the issues that I think that they will differ on is whether you can claim exclusive economic zones and extended continental shelf resources from a lot of these small island and rock features within the Spratly group. To some extent, this UN process for continental shelf claims has been one of the spurs to making this a more interesting issue once again. It's actually been one of the, I guess, provocative areas. It seems to me, those of us who've argued for a long time that China's position is a maximalist position, that they are asserting very extensive claims beyond what is permissible under the law of the Sea Convention, seems to be the case. So those who have argued for 20 years or so that China was only claiming the territories and perhaps territorial seas around those territories, China's words and actions don't seem to support that anymore. And so what's interesting here is not so much the sovereignty over the islands or even the adjacent waters, which can presume to be your territorial sea, but claims to sovereign rights. And sovereign rights apply in the exclusive economic zone and the continental shelf. There's no sovereignty in those zones of jurisdiction. And that starts to clarify a little bit what the Chinese are on about. And this is to my knowledge, the first time they've actually officially published a map showing the 9 dotted lines. I know it's not very clear, but that's just the way that the map was submitted to the UN. But the upshot from what the Chinese have been saying is that they do seem to be claiming rights within that entire water space, within those 9 dashed lines. And how you do that within the auspices of the Law of the Sea Convention, I have no idea. One particular dispute that I just thought I'd bring up very briefly, simply because it's been in the news a lot lately, is the issue of Scarborough Shoal. The Chinese claim Scarborough Shoal is somehow connected to another feature called Macclesfield Bank, but they're a long way apart. It's interesting because there's been this standoff between the Philippines and China in the last couple of months, and I was over in Manila in late April when a lot of this was going on, and unfortunately the Filipinos tend to operate in a very public way. All their policy-making discussions about how they're going to address this issue happens in public, which has sort of undermined the whole government position, which is a very dysfunctional way of making policy. So a lot of the this sort of personality-based policy-making processes occurring in the media. It was used for many years by the US Navy as a bombing range, and you can see some of the unexploded munitions on that bottom right-hand photo. And for all of those years, the Chinese never actually protested US activity. But I think this brings us in a way to one of the other reasons why the South China Sea has become more important, and that is because China has become more assertive. Partly they've become assertive in response to some of the submissions made to that Commissions on the Limits of the Continental Shelf process, but partly because I think they can now. They have the capabilities, whereas back in the 80s they simply didn't have the capabilities. And the expansion of the Navy, but also in particular their different civilian maritime enforcement agencies, and there are a number of those, has led them to actually become far more prominent, almost constant presence throughout much of this region, ships and patrol boats and aircraft. And this put a lot of pressure on some of the other claimants. It surprises me just how unprepared, for example, the Philippines were for this most recent crisis. It's not as if they haven't had problems with China over Scarborough Shoal before. Yet when this whole issue erupted earlier this year, they just didn't have any procedures in place. They managed to transfer primary responsibility from the Philippine Navy to the Philippine Coast Guard for the South China Sea last year, and the Philippine Coast Guard didn't have any rules of engagement in place when this happened. One of my former students had the job very quickly to actually promulgate new rules of engagement for the Coast Guard. They simply had not thought these issues through, yet they were not new issues. The point that I think I'd like to make is that a lot of what's driving the interest in the territorial disputes, and it has driven that interest over a number of years, is the potential for oil and gas in the seabed of the South China Sea. But there's still a very significant discrepancy between what we know is there and what is claimed to be there in terms of the resource. And certainly the numbers that have been produced by the Americans and the Russians don't tally anywhere near what the Chinese are claimed to be there. And so I certainly wouldn't expect the prospectivity of the South China Sea to be a sort of a new North Sea. I think one aspect of the whole resource dispute that's often overlooked, and to my mind, I think the point I'll try and stress is that fisheries is actually a very important part of this whole picture. Fisheries and the marine ecosystems which support those fisheries. Because when you take a broad view of Southeast Asia, many of those states are incredibly dependent on fisheries as a primary source of protein. The South China Sea itself is the fourth largest of the world's major fishing areas. And it's 10% of the global marine fisheries catch. That's a pretty significant amount. There are millions of people who rely not just upon these fisheries as a source of food, but also as a source of economic well-being, of income. And so the amount of fishermen and people who work in downstream processing is quite significant. And some of the numbers have been up to 100 million people rely on their economic well-being. And I can't vouch for those numbers either, but I think you get the idea that it's a significant issue. These areas are under significant stress, both from overfishing and illegal fishing, but also destructive fishing practices from both land and sea-based pollution. You've got the prospects of potentially of climate change-based changes in the longer term, and ocean acidification, which could be, I think, a lot worse than global warming itself. So these areas are under significant stress. I'll give you one just a brief example of the importance of some of these areas in the South China Sea around the Spratly Islands. The guy who claimed to have actually to take the photo of the unexploded munitions around Scarborough Shoal is an American marine biologist who spent probably 20 years or so based in the Philippines. And he was doing research into the fishery on the west coast of Luzon. Every season that fishery would be completely fished out. And the following year, the fish would sort of magically reappear. And they couldn't figure out where these fish were coming from. And the point that I'd like to make here is that whilst it's oil and gas that drives a lot of the conflict, that the militarisation, the pressing of territorial claims, in many ways I think fisheries are more important. The next issue that I'd like to make is that Indonesia studiously tries to avoid being characterised as a party to the South China Sea disputes, and of course it's not a party to any of the territorial disputes, but it is actually a party to the disputes, and in particular the EEZ that Indonesia claims in the area just beyond its Natuna Island group is disputed by China. Part of that falls within that 9-dashed line claim. And some of you may know Pak Hashim Jalal, Indonesia's former ambassador for the Royal Sea, and he has always, when I've talked to him about this, he's always made the point that, look, we sent this diplomatic note to China back in, I think, 1992 asking for clarification of the 9-dash line. What does it mean? What does it mean for Indonesia? And China's never formally replied to that. but he always made the case, oh no, it's not an issue, it's not a problem, it's not a problem, there's no issue here. Most recently, I was in an event with him in February, March, and his perspective has changed a little bit. And are still seeking clarification, and I think this is partly as a result of a couple of things that have happened. One is that Indonesia responded to China's response to the Malaysia-Vietnam submission to the CLCS, and in particular to the map. And they are stating quite clearly here down the bottom that the so-called 9 dotted lines map clearly lacks international legal basis and is tantamount to upset the Law of the Sea Convention. It's pretty strong words coming from Indonesia. The other thing worth noting about this is the date, 8 July 2010. Why that's significant is because in May and June 2010 there are a couple of incidents in that area of the Indonesian EEZ where Indonesian enforcement agencies tried to arrest some Chinese fishing boats, and those fishing boats were being supported by civilian maritime enforcement vessels of the Bureau of Fisheries Administration, China's Bureau of Fisheries Administration. They forced the Indonesians to let the Chinese fishermen go. The incidents were only publicised because there was a Japanese journalist from the Daily Mainichi in Indonesia at the time, found out about it, and it was published in that Japanese newspaper, and that's how we came to know about it. But from my discussions with both Ministry of Marine Affairs and Fisheries and Indonesian Navy personnel, they're still extremely hot under the collar about this and very resentful, and I don't think we've heard the last of this type of incident. The South China Sea, as I said before, is relatively significant in terms of its size, yet it's not the same as deploying your SSBNs into the open ocean. I've never been quite able to get a sense out of my submariner friends, perhaps for obvious reasons, whether SSBNs would be able to simply hide amongst all the acoustic noise of all the shipping that's going backwards and forwards to the South China Sea, or whether that's simply a lot more vulnerable because it's still relatively enclosed, and the deeper waters are only in part of the South China Sea itself. The last issue that I wanted to talk about are Australia's strategic interests in the South China Sea. And I've broken these down into first and second order concerns. One of our first order concerns obviously is the avoidance of conflict, and I think the Americans are in the same boat there. But we have to note that it is potentially a theatre of combat for the Australian Defence Force in a particular different, depending on the different contingencies that we can envisage. We have an interest in stock security and the international trade continuing, and we have a very strong interest in freedom of navigation, and this is an issue which concerns me greatly because it's something that Australia has been almost silent about. We've let the Americans do the heavy lifting diplomatically over a number of years on this issue, and I think that it's something that we ought to have been paying more attention to, and we want ASEAN to act, I think, more harmoniously and and cooperatively, perhaps have a common cause in some of these issues with China. I've just done a bit of selective highlighting and quoting here from the white paper, defence white paper, just noting that we do have a deep stake in the security of Southeast Asia, and that we would be concerned by any aggression against sea lanes in the region. Very quickly, my conclusions. unremarkable that these issues, these conflicts are going to continue, and that the sovereignty disputes are pretty much intractable. I don't think anyone's going to give any ground politically or diplomatically. Reiterate the importance of the food security issues that are often forgotten about. And so we can expect that the ADF, whatever happens with the defence budget in the next white paper, will have no choice but to consider this as one of our likely areas for operating. If we want the Americans to maintain their presence and their role, countries like Australia need to do more. Hopefully I haven't painted too gloomy a picture. I just end up on I think the idea that actually, whilst the South China Sea has many possibilities for conflict and future difficulties, I think it pales into comparison actually to the East China Sea disputes, which are often forgotten about. And the reason why they are so problematic is because the primary disputants, claimants, are two major powers, and that matters a hell of a lot. It makes it different.